Good day and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. We had a couple weeks break due to different schedules and traveling, but we are back with you just in time for a very, very important week and weeks really in global events and really history, to be honest. That is the UN General Assembly is currently taking place in New York. And as we know, as we've covered on the show, as we cover on People's Dispatch, this week has a lot of events involved in it. It's a moment where world leaders take the stage. It's a moment where they express their positions on certain kind of major developments in the world. We've been following up People's Dispatch, but we're going to bring you more insight into what's happening, what it means for the current state of things. And we have a lot of other stories, lots of protests taking place across the world. So we'll be right back with all of that and more.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Well, Prasanth, probably one of the defining events and processes of our time right now is the genocide in Gaza, and this has been front and center on the stage of the UN General Assembly, which kicked off the high-level session, kicked off yesterday. Two pretty prominent presentations. There's been a lot of discussion about Palestine, a lot of discussion about Israel, its actions in West Asia. Tell us what's happening there, what's happening on the ground, and what's happening in those New York halls.
Right. Look, Zoe, like you said, we have had, it's quite a interesting, unique session because I think it's the first time perhaps in recent years that there has been such a outswell of support towards recognizing the Palestinian state. We've seen in the past, both in this session and over the past few weeks, we've seen a number of countries, especially in the global north, recognizing Palestine. Now, it's very important to note that this was already done. The recognition was already, Palestine was already recognized by a lot of countries in the global south decades ago. So, if anything, these countries lagging far, far behind. But nonetheless, I think many of these countries have been forced or due to no other option, at least the countries in the global north, because in the face of what is so clearly a genocide, in the face of this brutal violence, they have been forced to accord recognition to the Palestinian state, both internally and externally, in some ways to kind of indicate that they are cognizant of this brutality, or they can't just close their eyes to that brutality. So that's what we're seeing in many of these presentations. The overall mood is generally calling for an end to the fighting, calling for some kind of a solution. People are talking about the two-state solution. Now it's an entirely different ballgame altogether about its feasibility. We won't go there today. But nonetheless, the fact is that this session, this UN General Assembly session has been historic in terms of the number of countries maybe making that recognition and the number of leaders willing to speak out on that issue. We've seen Gustavo Petro, for instance, making a very powerful presentation. We've seen the president of Indonesia. We've seen others as well. And I think we can anticipate more of those similar declarations and speeches, a very strong sentiment against Israel. And I think it's important to note that the fact that this is being reflected at the United Nations General Assembly, at the level of diplomats, where often what is said is far more measured, what is said is far more contained. Nonetheless, the fact that these kind of sentiments are being expressed is, I think, a significant one. On the other hand, I think it's also equally important to note that the Sumut flotilla is proceeding as well. I mean, I think that's the other side of the picture. In fact, the more important side, I would say, because the flotilla once again demonstrates how global public opinion is way ahead of what the leaders have been talking about in their meeting rooms and in their conference rooms. That's important, no doubt, but nonetheless, this shows how much public opinion, how much public anger, how much public conviction is ahead of those of the leaders. We have the flotilla with about, I think, 450 activists from across the world traveling in very, very dangerous circumstances to deliver aid. We've read reports of attacks taking place on the boats that happened, I believe, yesterday, or that happened on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. At least 15 drones were involved in that attack, if I'm not mistaken. Various projectiles dumped on those boats, etc. And let's be very clear, this is just the beginning of the attacks these boats are going to face. We have a cross-section of activists, we have members of European Parliament, we have a host of activists from across the world participating. And nonetheless, we should know that Israel is going to nonetheless attack this flotilla. They're given indications. We saw what happened with the previous freedom flotillas in June and July, and how Israel attacked those on board. This is a much bigger one, I believe. So one thing to definitely be watching, to raise awareness about, to keep talking about, is very, very important. The attacks on the ground, brutal attacks continuing, especially on Gaza City. Very systematic attempt to make sure that the entire city is completely destroyed, rendered unfit for living. I think the latest report says that some of the last few medical facilities have been forced to shut down or evacuate as well. Tens of thousands of people being given an ultimatum to hundreds of thousands of people given an ultimatum to either evacuate or face horrendous circumstances. So that's pretty much the situation on the ground. We'll be, I know there'll be a lot of People's Dispatch will be covering it very extensively, but I think equally important to see both of these, both the UN General Assembly session and the flotilla together, especially keep tracking the flotilla, because many of these attacks take place at night. Very essential to sort of make sure that the news spreads quickly as possible.
And I just add that Italy announced very recently that it would deploy a ship to accompany the flotilla, which is a huge development. And we'll see if other countries follow suit, given that their own citizens are being attacked by Israel, by Israeli drones. So that will definitely be something to watch for as well. Yesterday's session opened with Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who gave a very, very strong speech. And this speech comes at a very interesting time in Brazilian politics. On one hand, for example, we have massive protests that took place last week, this past weekend, protesting the actions of Brazilian Congress to essentially give lawmakers immunity, to say that lawmakers cannot be prosecuted, that they cannot face charges, and it will be decided kind of like amongst parliamentarians. And at the same time, coming at the time of Bolsonaro's trial underway. This trial, interestingly enough, despite the fact that it is dealing with a citizen, a Brazilian citizen who attempted to overturn the constitutional order by leading, a coup effort against, President-elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, it has become an international issue. And so we see that in Lula's speech yesterday, a lot of the language, a lot of the references he was making seem to be kind of in relation to the situation underway with Bolsonaro and the reaction of the Donald Trump administration. As we covered here, as Bolsonaro's conviction was kind of in the making, so to speak, as his trial was underway, Donald Trump decided that he was going to intervene on behalf of his friend, threatening sanctions and actually following through on a lot of that. And so essentially, as again, we've covered this a lot on People's Dispatch, but after, this whole process of Bolsonaro saying that there had been fraudulent elections, et cetera, the electronic voting system is unreliable, thousands of supporters stormed the Capitol, stormed Brasilia, destroying cultural patrimony, destroying the buildings. In this moment, thousands of people were arrested. But of course, the question was, how do you actually hold those responsible who were responsible for it? An attack that mirrored what we saw in the United States when Donald Trump's supporters also kind of similarly stormed the Capitol. This whole trial of holding Bolsonaro accountable for his actions and instigating people to participate in this, creating the narrative, has been kind of exemplary in the way that Brazil has actually said, we are not going to allow someone who created this situation to walk away scot-free. He may have been a president, but he committed all of these crimes. And so the trial of Bolsonaro has attracted a lot of attention. And Donald Trump, of course, having been part of a similar effort in the United States, saw the consequences that Bolsonaro was suffering with a lot of fear, of course, because this sets a precedent that if you are responsible for something like this, you have to pay the consequences. And so it has been this kind of parallel situation. But of course, in Brazil, the justice system decided to convict Bolsonaro. He's already on house arrest. He was convicted to and sentenced to 27 years in prison. This has already caused Brazil to face 50% tariffs, sanctions of ministers of justice, and there's threats of more kind of retaliatory efforts. So yesterday in his speech, Lula talked about sovereignty, he talked about democracy, and he talked about not being threatened by bullies. So really important there. And at the same time, the Congress is, of course, pushing for impunity, pushing for amnesty for Bolsonaro and his supporters. So there's a lot happening right now. And it's interesting because it is really taking on this international character, just because Donald Trump cannot, really does not want to see what could happen if someone's held accountable for these sort of actions. But the people of Brazil continue to resist on the streets, demanding prison for Bolsonaro and demanding that the Congress not be given this essentially carte blanche to commit any crime just because of the lawmakers. So really interesting there. Let's hop to another topic, which is actually, quite good news, Prasanth. A long-time political prisoner in Egypt, one of those 60,000 people who was in Egyptian prisons for their political activism, just walked free. Tell us about it.
Right, Zoe, like you said, yet another topic we have covered on this show quite often, actually. Alaa Abd walking out of prison, very emotional scenes, I believe, the day before yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. And, he's been in prison for the bulk of, since 2000, I believe since 2011 also, he's been in prison for so many years. He was very active in the Arab Spring protests, became one of the phases of that for his, especially for his tech activism during that time. He was put in jail. When Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the current military dictator of Egypt, came to power, he was once again, brought under the scanner, convicted in 2014, released in 2019, very briefly once again, arrested in 2019 on charges such as spreading fake news and stuff. And, often most of these charges, as we know, across the world, these charges are purely used to politically torment those who speak out, those who make those in power, the rulers, uncomfortable, so to speak. And in 2019, he was the case went on for 2021. 2 years later, he was convicted. And since he was arrested in 2019, it meant that since he had a 5-year term, he should have been out in 2024. That's last year. However, he was not released because the Egyptian authorities decided that the 2 years he had spent before the trial would not count in his prison term as well. And even the trial was marked by all kinds of irregularities. We've reported about that. So, his case had become one of those global flashpoints, which really indicated the fact that Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was running, a full-fledged authoritarian state. I mean, like I said, it's just one example. In 2019, there were protests against el-Sisi as well. Again, massive arrests, a lot of irregularities in the process. Over time, the government did begin to release people here and there in few numbers. But again, the important thing to note was that many of these were, portrayed as benevolence by the government, as opposed to actually the legal process taking its, due, or say the procedure being respected, or the evidence being properly presented, or whatever. So even in this case, I believe the Egyptian Human Rights Organization gave an appeal, and Abdel Fattah el-Sisi gave a pardon. So there's very little acknowledgement of the fact that A, the case was so absurd, B, despite the 5 years passing, he was not, those 2 years were not taken into consideration. None of that has been acknowledged. And I believe reports say that, one of the reasons Alaa Abd has been released is also the fact that Egypt has been facing a ton of international and domestic criticism over how it has completely betrayed the people of Gaza, since Egypt has been enforcing that blockade from 2007 onwards, and has been pretty much acting like a collaborator with Israel all these since for the past 2 years as well. So huge amount of dissatisfaction inside Egypt as well. So Abdel Fattah el-Sisi also may be trying to cool tempers. In addition to Alaa Abdel Fattah, a few others were also released. So definitely a very happy day. We know that his mother was on hunger strike for many, many months. Her health deteriorated very, very drastically. He had also gone on hunger strike in solidarity with her. He had also gone on hunger strike during the COP summit I believe it was in 2022. And, even at that time, or 23, even at that time, there was a lot of talk about the fact that here was Egypt holding this global session while so many thousands of political activists were behind bars. So very, very happy for Alaa Abd also thinking about all those political prisoners, including across the world, who were right now behind bars for just the crime of speaking out, for just the crime of having different opinions and refusing to bow before those in power. And hopefully all of them come out soon as well. But definitely this is not going to solve Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's problems in Egypt. So we'll wait and see what's going to happen.
Definitely an incredible news, and that video is just so touching to see him dancing, to see him embracing his family. These are the moments we have to remember to keep us going forwards and to remind us why we continue in the struggle. And I'll take the opportunity to once again remind people to follow People's Dispatch on all social media platforms. Subscribe to the show on Spotify. You can listen to it there. You can listen to it elsewhere. We want to hear from you. We hope you're receiving People's Dispatch content in all different ways, audio, video. Of course, our main of reading and our text that we produce on the website. Bookmark peoplesdispatch.org. Make sure to not miss any articles. Of course, we go into a lot of these stories in more depth, and so you can get more of that there. So make sure to subscribe. And once again, we're gonna hop all the way back to Latin America to talk about a topic we cover a lot, which is Venezuela and the U.S. attacks on Venezuela. We have spoken about this. We immediately responded and we spoke about the U.S. airstrike, really, on a fishing boat, later found out to be a fishing boat of Venezuelan fishers. A couple weeks back, the U.S. accused, said that they had taken out a major drug trafficking boat. The attacks from the United States have continued. The intimidation has continued against Venezuela. Yesterday in Donald Trump's speech, he even boasted about these, airstrikes that they're carrying out, allegedly taking out massive drug trafficking networks led by the Venezuelan government. Of course, as we said on this show, the evidence itself, the reports produced by the United States, by its different agencies, proves that this is completely made up. However, because the U.S. continues to make these threats, Venezuela has continued to get ready. It has continued to prepare. It has continued to kind of create this culture, this environment of preparedness, of readiness for any attack. Millions of people have enrolled in the militia, the People's Militia. There have been mobilizations of, for example, and exercises of the military forces, training camps for people joining the militia. It is a moment kind of maximum readiness, it seems, in Venezuela, and continuing to emphasize the centrality of the defense of Venezuela, the defense of Venezuela's sovereignty. This is not the first time the United States has threatened military action against Venezuela. It's something that we've seen consistently since the Bolivarian Revolution triumphed in 1999, and even before that, even when there were neoliberal rulers, even when, we've seen this in many Latin American countries, even when there are people who are allied to the United States or in some way serve the interests of the United States, if it's not exactly how they want it, the threat of military action is always on the table. And I think we remember that famous quote of a member of the Trump administration saying, the military option's not off the table. It's from the first administration, when the maximum pressure campaign of the sanctions, the crippling, debilitating sanctions, which in fact killed tens of thousands of people as it is. So, once again, this threat of military action has not caused, a weakening of confidence in the country, but it's actually mobilized people. Those images are quite impressive. People in this essentially military parade, it has had the opposite impact to maybe what Washington thought. The Venezuelan people have been involved in this revolutionary process for over 2 decades. So they're used to these threats. They know what it means. And when you get these threats from the United States, it means that you're standing up to the aggressor. You're standing up to the country that has continually said that you cannot make your own path. You have to make a path that serves us. So I think, once again, we're seeing the Venezuelan people stand up. We're seeing them reject this meddling and uniting around the defense of the homeland, not only just Chavista sectors, but even other political sectors. And this defense of sovereignty is an infectious sentiment. And we're seeing it not just in Latin America, not just in Venezuela and Cuba, but in other regions, mainly one that's been, quite a hot topic because of this really immense people's uprising is in the Sahel states. So, Prasanth, very important anniversary that just passed. Tell us what's happening there.
Yeah, we missed it because of how over the past few weeks, but the September 16th was the second anniversary of the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States. Very, very important moment in the region. It's very difficult to sometimes talk about the region because so much keeps happening. I believe People's Dispatch has a story about the AES countries, that is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, announcing that they would leave the International Criminal Court. This announcement was made on Monday, if I'm not mistaken, and very fascinating because they say that the International Criminal Court has functioned as a tool of imperialist interests. It kind of echoes a sentiment felt especially strongly in Africa, other parts of the global south, where leaders from those regions are hauled before the ICC. They are tried, sometimes with very good reasons. But this similar, say, people, for instance, who are responsible for similar crime, you'll never find a U.S. president before the International Criminal Court, although arguably every U.S. president since the court was formed deserves to be in front of the ICC, but you'll never hear that. You'll never hear the Secretary General of NATO being on trial before the ICC. All them, quite sure every one of them deserves to be. So that is a very widely prevailing sentiment, and the AES countries have decided to kind of withdraw from the ICC. They are they already announced their own court. They announced it in May. And it's very interesting because what they're trying to do with this AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, is not just kind of build a loose coalition, but actually focus on institutionalizing their fight for sovereignty. And I think that is one of the most important things that can be done in today's at today's point of time. We know that, and we talked about the struggle for sovereignty across across the world. In some cases, it's people's movements. In some cases, it's people's movements with their political leadership, with their governments. But it's quite rare to see instances of this going beyond just one country, but actually extending into three neighboring countries who are marching together in this quest for sovereignty, and who understand that sometimes this requires more than one country working together. It's not enough that just one government take those steps. And it's especially true in the case of the Sahel region, where many of these countries are struggling from the effects of French neocolonialism. The economy is being tied to the French, their militaries, their political structure, their social organizing, their cultural artifacts, everything is so closely tied to France that there is an entire, there's a battle to be fought on every front for achieving sovereignty. As I think we've had a lot in recent times. People's Dispatch has had some great articles. Tricontinental, we had that. They had a dossier on that, and it's very interesting to see across all these interviews, all these articles. What comes out is the fact that activists across the region strongly believe that they're going beyond what they call flag independence into a true sense of independence, and that involves actually eliminating foreign influence from each and every aspect of their lives. So the fact that they're actually trying to set up these kind of institutions, they're setting up a common military force, they're even something seemingly minor as having their own anthem or having their own flag, it actually has quite a dramatic impact. But they're also moving towards discussing the possibility of a common currency, which would be huge. They've opened their borders, looking at even greater financial integration. All of these together are huge steps, which can actually help create an alternative. And if the Sahelian countries, who have really struggled, economically, politically, socially, militarily, are actually able to present a sustainable alternative with the support of the people's movements, I think that would be a huge model across the world, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, where countries may economically be way more developed, but actually, can see these as other ways of achieving that kind of sovereignty. So I think it's a very, very important experiment that we need to keep following. A lot of challenges, no questions about that. The security situation, especially, very, very challenging. But the fact that these countries have embarked on that experiment and are taking these steps so drastically, like withdrawing from ECOWAS, for instance, at that point there was a very strong need. But the fact that they've chosen not to go back, but they're engaging with ECOWAS, they're not completely, saying that we refuse to acknowledge it, but nonetheless they made it very clear that we are going to engage on our terms. And I think all the engagement with, for instance, Russia, where they're trying to achieve energy sovereignty. I think Niger has recently announced that there's going to be a new nuclear plant with Russian collaboration. So all of that together, I think, really presents a very interesting experiment, which is very difficult to see in today's time. So, a very fascinating development, 2 years of the AES. Let's see what the next year brings.
I would add that Brasil de Fato had a reporter who was present in Niger in the conference that you were at, Prasanth, who visited Benin, who visited Burkina Faso, and made a fantastic documentary. I urge everyone to drop what you're doing and watch it. It's extremely moving, using fragments of speeches from Thomas Sankara, speeches from Ibrahim Traoré, really showing how this is a continuation of that legacy, showing how it's a continuation of that sentiment of building Pan-Africanism. And I think even what you said, Prasanth, is so important to highlight. These countries are facing serious security threats. And it's very tempting for countries of the South to say, okay, well, we can get support from, our more well-funded, well-armed Western allies that are so eager to help us. And it's, these countries have said, actually, it's you who's behind this problem, and you create the problem and then you want to fix it. So extremely brave, extremely bold. And truly, I think if people watch this documentary, they will walk away feeling that spirit and that excitement and wanting to learn more. So highly recommend. And to finish us off, I just want to reflect upon kind of two major protest movements that are happening right now in South America, neighboring countries, in Ecuador and Peru. Tens of thousands of people on the streets. These are two countries that really have been simmering for the past couple of years. Of course, very different contexts, but countries that have had people on the streets demanding justice, demanding an end to neoliberal cuts against their livelihoods. In Ecuador right now, the major driver of these protests is the government of Daniel Noboa, who has essentially, he's been a very complicated president for many reasons, and anyone who has been following People's Dispatch will have been following our quite meticulous coverage of the different kind of, to say scandals and controversies, whether it's being involved in accused of corruption, or whether it's, completely violating the electoral laws, or now calling for a constituent assembly to overturn and rewrite the constitution that was created by the people in 2008, cutting fuel subsidies. So these are measures that hit directly at the heart of the people in Ecuador, who have been suffering since 2017 under harsh neoliberalism. They have been out on the streets year after year saying, don't cut our subsidies. We defend the Constitution of 2008. We want rights. We want, all of these things that we fought for and worked to build. And Daniel Noboa, of course, he's been president during this time of unprecedented rise in violence in the country, and has said, the way we're going to solve this is deploying the military, cutting back on social benefits. And of course, as we know, this is a story we've seen before. People are out on the streets and saying, we do not agree with this. And I think especially the figure of Daniel Noboa is so hated in the country. He's the son of, the richest man in Ecuador. His own family business of banana exportations is accused of being involved in drug trafficking. The story writes itself. And then again, to Ecuador's south, we see more protests against the coup government of Dina Boluarte. We were on the ground in 2022. The Peruvian people have been protesting the break in constitutional order since the coup against Pedro Castillo, which Dina Boluarte has been overseeing the government since then, and has enacted, not only repressed and killed over 60 people in these protests, but also has enacted a series of measures which the people again are saying, we voted in a president who said we're going to make, there can be no more poor in a rich country, saying Peru has so many resources. How is it that there's still people in extreme poverty? Now Dina Boluarte, attempting to enact a pension reform, which makes their privatized system even worse, if that were possible. And so people have been out on the streets. They vowed to continue staying on the streets. It's a continuation of the protests against the coup, a continuation of the protests against this breaking constitutional order, and demands that their will be respected, that they can live in a country where another issue, major increase in insecurity, major increase in violence against people on a daily basis. So those protests are going to continue. Ecuador last night, really popped off, to say it in that way. There was massive repression. People were getting pepper sprayed in their eyes and their faces so they wouldn't be able to tell their names to legal observers. Both situations are really, on the verge of erupting into an even greater social explosion like we've seen take place in many countries in Latin America. So we'll be keeping our eyes on that. Again, as we said at the beginning of the show, this is the UN week. All eyes are on New York. All eyes are on the leaders of the world and their different positions. So it's a very interesting moment. We're seeing so much happening on the front in the global south, so much happening in the United States. Leaders gathered, they're going to talk about it, and we'll see how it proceeds. So we'll be back next week. I'm sure we'll have even more stories. We'll see what comes in the next couple of days in the UN General Assembly. These protests, which are going to continue. So we'll be back with all of that and more. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Prasanth, for your insights, and we'll be back next week.